Hello, and welcome back to Storytime Classics Live. Today we will be reading the classic story, The Nutcracker and the Mouse King. So that's going to be a wonderful little story to jump into there. Hope everyone's having a great day today. And let's just go ahead, as I always say, and jump on into the story. And this is The Nutcracker and the Mouse King by E.T.A. Hoffmann. All through the day of Christmas Eve, Dr. Stahlbaum's children had not been allowed into the dining room, much less into the drawing room opening out of it. In a corner of the back parlor, Fred and Mary sat cuddled up together, shuddering with excitement of mystery. For, though twilight had come on, nobody brought in any lights this evening. Fred whisperingly told his 7-year-old sister how, since early in the morning, he had listened to the stir and bustle and the soft hammerings in these forbidden chambers. Also, how, not long ago, a small, dark man, with a great box under his arm, had come slipping over the floor, but he knew well that this was nobody else than Godfather Drosselmeyer. Then Mary clapped her little hands for joy, crying, "Ah, what fine things will Godfather Drosselmeyer have made for us!" Counselor Drosselmeyer, so people called him, was far from a handsome man, short and thin, with many wrinkles on his face, and a great black patch where his right eye should have been. So he had no hair on his head, so he wore a very fine white wig, which seemed to be made of glass. So clever a piece of work was it. The godfather himself, indeed, was a very clever workman, who actually knew all about clocks and could even make them with his own hands. When any of the fine clocks in the Stahlbaum's house went out of order and did not strike, Godfather Drosselmeyer would come, take off his glass wig and his drab coat, tie on a blue ribbon to blue apron, and stick sharp things into the clocks inside, so that little Mary felt quite sorry for it. But this did the clock no harm, which, on the contrary, got to life again and once began to tick and strike and chime to the delight of all the family. He never came without bringing something pretty in his pockets for the children. Now a puppet that could move its eyes and make bows most comic to behold. Now a box out of which would hop a little bird, or something else of the kind. But for Christmas he always prepared some grand, elaborate piece of work that cost him much trouble, on which account, when given to the children, it was carefully taken charge of by their parents. Ah, what fine things will Godfather Drosselmeyer have made for us, Mary wondered. But Fred was of opinion it could this time be no other than a castle, in which all kinds of beautiful soldiers marched up and down, and were drilled, and other soldiers were to come, who should try to get into the castle. But then the soldiers inside would fire off cannon, and there would be such a grand booming and banging. "No, no," Mary cut him short. "Godfather Drosselmeyer has told me of a beautiful garden with a great pond in it, on which splendid swans with gold bands round their necks are to swim about and sing such pretty songs. Then a little girl will run up from the garden and call the swans to her and feed them with gingerbread." "Swans don't eat gingerbread," broke in Fred rather rudely, and Grandfather Drosselmeyer could not make a whole garden either. Anyhow, we got a few of the toys he makes. They are always taken away from us. So I like much better the things Papa and Mama give us, which we will have for our very own, and can do as we like with them." Then the children went on guessing and guessing what it would be this time. Mary remarked how Missy Gertrude, her big doll, was much changed for the worse, since she kept tumbling on the floor more awkwardly than ever, which never happened without leaving dirty marks on her face. And as for keeping her clothes clean, that was out of the question. All of the scoldings in the world thrown away on her. Fred, for his part, dwelt on the fact that a fine wooden horse was much wanted in his stable. Also, how his toy soldiers were greatly deficient in cavalry, as his papa must be aware. These children knew that their parents had bought for them all sorts of fine presents, yet they were persuaded that Father Christmas looked on them with friendly eyes, and bestowed from his bounteous hand the gifts that came more welcome now than any other time. As they kept on whispering over the expected presents, their older sister Louisa came in to remind them that it is Father Christmas who, through the hands of their dear parents, always supplies what will afford them real joy and pleasure, as he knows better how to do than children themselves, who should therefore not be wishing and hoping for all sorts of things, but quietly and dutifully await what is to be given to them. Little Mary became thoughtfully silent, but Fred murmured to himself, "I should like a horse, and some hussars, though." It had grown quite dark. Fred and Mary, sitting closely side by side, did not dare to speak any word. They fancied they could hear a fluttering of soft wings about them, and a strain of beautiful music in the distance. A bright light gleamed upon the wall. Then they knew that Father Christmas was flying away on shining clouds to other happy children. All at once, a silvery ball went cling, cling, and the doors flew open, and such a brilliance streamed out of the great room that the children stood as if enchanted on the threshold, with loud exclamations of wonder. But Papa and Mamma came forward and took Fred and Mary by the hand, saying, come along, dear children, and see what Father Christmas has given you." Chapter 2. The Presents. I put it to yourself, my friendly reader or listener, Fred, Fanny, Eddie, or whatever be your name, and beg you to bring clearly before your eyes your own last Christmas tree or table adorned with pretty, gay presents. Then you can very well understand how these children stopped, dumbfounded, with sparkling eyes. How only after a little Mary cried with a deep sigh of delight, "Oh, how beautiful! Oh, how beautiful!" and how Fred jumped for joy to relieve his feelings. All the past year, indeed, they must have been particularly good and well behaved, for never had they such a number of delightful presents as this time. The great fir tree in the middle bore ever so many gold and silver apples and buds and blossoms. Every branch hung thick with almonds and brightly colored sugar plums, and other best kinds of goodies. But the finest thing about the marvelous tree must not be forgotten, that 100 small lights twinkled like stars among its foliage, so that, illuminated as it was inside and outside, it seemed to invite the children to pluck its fruits and flowers. And round about the tree everything shone gay and splendid. All the fine presents were there. Who could ever describe them? Mary caught sight of the most elegant dolls, all sorts of neat little dolls' furniture, and, what seemed finest of all, a silk frock prettily decked with colored ribbons stood spread out on a dress stand before her eyes, so that she could admire it from every side. As she did, crying out again and again, oh, the pretty dear dress. And may I really put it on?" Meanwhile, Fred, galloping and trotting round 3 or 4 times, tried his new cock-horse, which he indeed found bridled and saddled on the table. Dismounting, he reported that it was a wild creature, but no matter. He would soon break it in, and proceeded to muster his new squadron of hussars, who were gorgeously equipped in red and gold, with silver swords, and rode such shiny white horses that these also might almost be believed of pure silver. The children had got over their excitement a little, and were able to take a look at the picture books, which lay open so as to display pretty flowers and brightly colored figures of people, even of dear little children at play, painted as naturally as if they really lived and spoke. Yes, Fred and Mary were settling down upon these wonderful picture books when, cling, 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 ling, the bell rang again. They knew that now it was Godfather Drosselmeyer's turn, and ran to the table standing by the wall. The screen that had so long concealed it was quickly drawn away, and what did the young folks see? On a green lawn bespangled with gay flowers stood a most noble castle, all plate glass windows and gilded towers. A chime of bells was heard. Doors and windows flew open, and you saw how very tiny most elegant ladies and gentlemen with feathers in their hats and trailing skirts moved inside the rooms. In the central hall, that seemed to be on fire, so many lights burned there in silver chandeliers. Children, wearing short coats and vests, were dancing to the music of the chimes. A gentleman in an emerald green cloak kept looking out through the window, nodding and disappearing by turns, while a figure, just like Godfather Drosselmeyer himself, but scarcely higher than Papa's thumb, would, from time to time, come and stand at the castle door, and then go in again. With his arms leaning on the table, Fred had examined the dancing and walking figures, and now he said, "Godfather Drosselmeyer, will you let me go into your castle?" The counselor replied to him, this would never do. Indeed, he spoke truly, for it was foolish of Fred to want to go into the castle, which, gilded towers and all, was not so high as himself. Fred had to admit that, after time, as the ladies and gentlemen went on walking up and down in the same way, the children dancing, the green man looking out at the window, Godfather Drosselmeyer's likeness coming to the door, he cried impatiently, "Godfather Drosselmeyer, now will you come out for once at the other door?" "That won't do, dear Fred," answered the counselor. "Well," said Fred again, "just make the green man, who looks out so often, walk about with the others." "Well, that won't do either," repeated the counselor. "Couldn't the children come downstairs?" persisted Fred. "I should like to see them nearer." "Oh, all that won't do," said the counselor, not in very good humor. "The machinery has to work as it is made." "Is that the way of it?" exclaimed Fred in a tone of contempt. "Nothing will do. I tell you what, Godfather Drosselmeyer, if your fine little figures in the castle can only go on doing the same things, they are not worth much, and I don't particularly care for them. No, I would rather have my hussars, and they can maneuver forwards, backwards, as I like, and are not shut up in a house." And with this, he ran to the table, and made his squadron on their silver horses trot up and down, and wheel and charge and shoot to his heart's content. Mary also had quietly slipped away, for she, too, soon grew tired of the strutting and capering of the puppets in the castle, but was so polite and good-natured that she would not show it so plainly as her brother Fred. Counselor Drosselmeyer spoke rather crossly to the parents. "Such a skill of contrivance is not for senseless children. I will pack up my castle again." But the mother came forward and got him to show her the construction of the wonderfully ingenious works by which the little puppets were set in motion. The counselor took it all to pieces and put it together again. This put him into a rather better temper, and he presented the children, furthermore, with some pretty brown men and women made of gingerbread, with gilt faces, hands, and legs, which quite delighted them. Sister Louisa had, by her mother's wish, put on the handsome dress which was her present, and looked very nice in it. But when Mary was to try on her new frock, she thought she would rather look at it a little longer, and they allowed her to have her own way. Chapter 3. The Favorite. Mary, in fact, could not tear herself away from the table of presents, since she had just discovered on it something till now unseen. The marching off of Fred's hussars, previously paraded close in front of the Christmas tree, left exposed to view a very remarkable little man, who stood still in the background, as if quietly awaiting his turn for notice. His figure, indeed, was not much to be proud of, for, besides that his rather long, thick body by no means fitted his small, thin legs, his head also seemed far too big. His nice clothes, however, which bespoke a person of taste and cultivation, went far to make up this deformity. He wore a very fine, shiny, violet hussar jacket, with many white buttons and braidings, pantaloons of the same stuff, and the most elegant boots that ever adorned the feet of a dandy undergraduate. Aye, or of an officer. They fitted his neat little legs as closely as if painted on them. Ridiculous it was that, with this costume, he had hanging behind him a short, clumsy cloak or hood, which looked exactly like wood, and a queer woodsman's cap on his head. But Mary bethought herself that godfather Drosselmeyer also sometimes wore a very ugly lounging hat, jacket, and a dreadful cap, yet was a dear, good grandfather for all that. Also, she considered that their grandfather would not be nearly so good-looking as the small figure, even if, in other respects, he were dressed out as smartly. As Mary kept looking harder and harder at this mannequin, who had quite taken her heart at first sight, she came to perceive what a kindly nature was expressed on his countenance. His clear, green, and certainly too prominent eyes bespoke nothing but friendliness and benevolence. It suited that his looks well, and that his chin bore a well-trimmed beard of white cotton, which set off the pleasant smile on his bright red mouth. "Papa," cried Mary at length, "who is to have this dearest little man on the Christmas tree?" "That," said her father, "that fellow, my dear child, is to make himself useful to you all. His work is to crack hard nuts for you, and he belongs to Louisa as much as to Fred and to you." With this, her father carefully took the figure off the table, and lifting up its wooden cloak, made the mannequin's mouth gape open to show 2 rows of very sharp white teeth. Then he told Mary to put in a nut, and crack! The man had crushed it, so that the shell fell in pieces, and Mary got a small kernel in her hand. Now Mary and all might know that the elegant little man belonged to the race of Nutcrackers, and practiced the profession of his ancestors. The little girl cried out for joy, and when her father said, "Since friend Nutcracker pleases you so much, dear Mary, he shall be your special charge and pet, though, as I said, Louisa and Fred have as much right to use him as you." Mary at once took him into her arms and made him crack nuts, yet picking out the smallest ones, in order that the mannequin might not have to stretch his mouth so wide open, which was not good for him. Louisa came to look, and for her father, and for her also friend Nutcracker had to perform his service, which he seemed to do with good will, for he kept on smiling in the most amiable way. Meanwhile, Fred had grown tired of all his riding and drilling, so when he heard such a pleasant cracking of nuts, he ran to his sisters and laughed heartily at the funny little man who, as Fred also liked to eat nuts, passed from hand to hand and was never allowed to stop opening and shutting up his mouth. Fred always kept shoving in the biggest and the hardest nuts, but all of a sudden there was a crack, crick, then 3 teeth fell out of Nutcracker's mouth, and his underjaw went loose and wobbly. "Oh, my poor dear Nutcracker," cried Mary, snatching him out of Fred's hands. "What a silly, stupid fellow," exclaimed Fred. "Sits up for being a Nutcracker, and hasn't a good set of grinders. He doesn't seem to be very first-rate at his business. Hand him over, Mary. He shall go on cracking nuts for me, even though he loses all his teeth and his whole chin into the bargain, which is what such a good-for-nothing he deserves." "No, no," cried Mary in tears. "You are not to have him, my dear Nutcracker. Just see how sadly he looks at me and shows his sore little mouth. But you are a cruel little boy. You beat your horse and have your soldiers shot." "That's what should be. You don't understand these things," answered Fred. "But the Nutcracker belongs to me as much as to you. Hand him over here." Mary began to cry bitterly, and made haste to wrap up the wounded Nutcracker in her small pocket handkerchief. Her friends and godfather Drosselmeyer interfered. The latter, to Mary's grief, took Fred's part, but her father said, "I have put Nutcracker under Mary's protection, and since, as I see, he now needs it, she has full power over him, and nobody is to say a word against her. Besides, I am very much surprised at Fred, that he should require fresh duty of a man injured on service. As a good soldier, he ought to know that wounded men are never put back in the ranks." Fred was much ashamed of himself, and, without troubling further about nuts or Nutcracker, slipped off to the other side of the table where his hussars had been posted for the night, after putting out the proper pickets. Mary picked up Nutcracker's lost teeth. Around his hurt chin she bound a nice white ribbon, taken off her dress, and then wrapped the poor little fellow, who looked very wan and dejected, more carefully than ever in her pocket handkerchief. Thus she held him, rocking him like a baby in her arms, while she turned over the pretty picture books which lay among the rest of the presents. She became quite cross, as was not at all usual with her, when Godfather Drosselmeyer laughed a great deal, and kept asking how she could go on so with that hideous little creature. The strange resemblance to Drosselmeyer, which had struck her at first setting eyes on the mannequin, came again to her mind, and she spoke quite seriously. "Who knows, Godfather, whether you, if you were to make yourself as fine as my dear Nutcracker, and had as nice shiny boots on, who knows whether you would look as pretty as he does?" Mary did not understand why her parents laughed so hard, or why the counselor got so red in the face, and did not join in the laugh as heartily as before. There may have been some particular reason for this. Chapter 4. Marvels. In the parlor at Dr. Stahlbaum's, on the left-hand side as you go in at the door, stood a high glass cupboard, where the children kept all those fine things that were given them every Christmas. Louisa was quite a little girl when their father had the cupboard made by a very clever carpenter, but put in such clear panes of glass and arranged the whole so well that the treasures inside looked almost brighter and prettier than when you had them in your hands. On the highest shelf, out of Fred and Mary's reach, stood Godfather Drosselmeyer's works of art. Right beneath was the shelf for the picture books. The lowest compartments Mary and Fred could fill with what they pleased, but was always the way that Mary took the bottom shelf as the dwelling of her dolls, and Fred's troops had the other one over it for their cantonments. Such as was now the arrangement, while Fred quartered his hussars above, Mary laid Missy Gertrude by in a corner below, and set out the newly finely dressed doll in the well-furnished apartment, and invited herself to take goodies with her. Very well furnished was the apartment, I have said, and it is true, for I know not if you, my attentive reader, Mary, like the little Stahlbaum girl, her name, you know, was also Mary. I mean, whether you possess such a fine flower-chintz sofa, several dear little chairs, a small tea-table, and above all, a very neat, clean bed for your dolls to take their repose in. All this was in the corner of the cupboard shelf. Those walls here were even papered with pretty pictures, and you can easily believe that the new doll, who, as Mary learned the same evening, was named Missy Clara, found herself very comfortable in this apartment. It was late in the evening, getting on for midnight indeed, and godfather Drosselmeyer had long gone home, and yet the children could not tear themselves away from the glass cupboard, for all their mothers telling them it was time to go to bed. "To tell the truth," cried Fred at length, "my hussars would make some rest now, and so long as I am looking at them, I know that not one of them dare nod." With this he went off, but Mary earnestly begged, "Only a little while, dear mother. Let me stay here only a little while longer. I have so much still to look after, and soon as I have finished, I will go straight to bed." Mary was a very dutiful, sensible child, so her good mother could, without anxiety, leave her alone among the toys. But in case of her being so much enchanted by the new doll and the other playthings as to forget the candles burning by the cupboard, her mother put them all out. Then only the lamp which hung from the ceiling and the center of the room spread a soft, pleasant light around. "Come soon to bed, dear Mary, or you will not be up in good time in the morning," called out the mother, and she went off to her own bedroom. When Mary found herself alone, she quickly set about what she had in mind to do, which she hardly herself knew why. She did not care to be seen by her mother. All this time she had been nursing the injured Nutcracker in her arms, wrapped in a handkerchief. Now she laid him carefully upon the table, softly unwrapped him, and examined his hurts. Nutcracker was very pale, but yet he smiled, with such an air of melancholy kindness that it went right to Mary's head. "Dear little Nutcracker," she murmured, "don't be angry with my brother Fred for hurting you so much. He did not mean any great harm. He is only rather unfeeling through that rough soldier life, but in other ways a real kind-hearted boy, I can assure you. But now I will take very good care of you, till you have grown quite well and happy again. Your teeth shall be put in firm, and your shoulders set straight by godfather Drosselmeyer, who understands these things." So Mary was going to say, but could not finish the sentence, for, as she mentioned the name of Drosselmeyer, friend Nutcracker made an ugly, cross face, and his eyes seemed to shoot out green sparks. Just then, just as Mary was ready to feel terrified out of her wits, there again she saw the worthy Nutcracker's face, as placid as ever, with its melancholy smile, and now she knew that a draught in the room, making the lamp flicker, must have so transmogrified his countenance for a moment. Am I not a foolish girl to be so easily frightened? I actually believed this wooden figure was making faces at me. But I am really getting so fond of Nutcracker. He is such a funny and such a good-natured fellow, and so he must be properly nursed as he be deserves. With this, she took Nutcracker on her arm, approached the glass cupboard, bent down before it, and thus addressed the new doll. I beg you very particularly, Miss Clara, to give up your bed to the stick, wounded Nutcracker, and manage as well as you can on the sofa. Remember that you are quite well and strong, or you would not have such plump red cheeks, and that very few of the handsomest dolls possess so soft sofas as you have. Missy Clara, in all her Christmas finery, looked very stuck up and sulky, and did not answer a word. Why should I make so much work about it? Exclaimed Mary, drawing forward the bed, where she laid Nutcracker very gently and softly bound up his injured shoulder with a very pretty little ribbon from her own dress, and covered him snugly with the bedclothes up to his nose. He is not to stay beside that naughty Clara, she said, and lifted bed, Nutcracker, and all to the shelf above, so that she lay close to the pretty village of toy houses in which Fred's hussars were quartered. She shut up the cupboard, and was going off to her bedroom when, now, listen, children, there began a soft, soft whispering and stirring and rustling all around her, behind the stove, behind the chairs, behind the cupboard. The clock ticked louder and louder, and gave a whir as if it were going to strike, but did not. Mary looked at it. The great gilded owl which sat on the top had let down its wings, so as to cover the whole clock face, at the same time stretching out its ugly cat-like face and its hooded beak, and more loudly came the ticks as plain as words. Click, clock, click. Lo, softly tick. Mouse King's ears are quick. Prr, prr, ting, tong. Sing out the old song, but strike in a low tune. It will be over soon. And prr, whir, went the clock 12 times, but dully and hoarsely, as if its notes were muffled. Mary began to creep all over, and in her fright she was on the point of running away when she saw how Godfather Drosselmeyer seemed to have taken the place of the owl, his drab coat skirts hanging down on both sides like wings. Yet she made an effort to be brave, and called out, almost crying, "Godfather Drosselmeyer! Godfather Drosselmeyer! Whatever are you doing up there? Come down, and don't frighten me so terribly, you naughty Godfather Drosselmeyer." But now there broke out from all sides a wild creaking and squeaking, and soon, behind the walls, there was a trotting and a galloping, as of 1,000 tiny feet, and 1,000 little lights shone through the chinks in the floor. They were not tapers, no, but small sparkling eyes, and Mary perceived that a host of mice were everywhere peeping forth and working themselves out. Presently they were going trot, trot, hop, hop, round the room, troops of mice, always growing more numerous and spirited, galloped up and down, and at length formed themselves in ranks, as Fred was accustomed to draw up his troops when he gave orders for a battle. This struck Mary as very comical, and not having any natural horror of mice, like many other children, her dread would have passed off, when all at once there came a squeak so piercing and startling that an ice-cold shudder ran down her back. Oh, what did she see? Yes, indeed, my worthy reader, Fred, or whatever your name be, I know that your heart is as much in the right place as that of the clever and brave field marshal Fred Stahlbaum. But, all the same, had you only seen what came before Mary's eyes, you would have run away on the spot. I believe you would have jumped quickly into bed and drawn the clothes farther over your eyes than there was any need for. That is just what Mary could not do, for, would you believe it, right under her feet burst up sand and lime and crumbled stone, as if thrown out by subterranean power. And from the floor arose 7 mouse heads, with 7 glittering crowns, hissing and squeaking terribly. Before long, the body also squeezed itself clear, on the neck of which grew these 7 heads, and the huge 7-crowned mouse shrieked with all its throats, 3 times piping out a greeting to his army, that at once set itself in motion, and charged trot, trot, pit, pit, dot, dot, straight upon the cupboard, straight upon Mary, who still stood by its glass front. The girl's heart had been beating so violently for distress and terror that she believed it would soon burst out of her bosom, and then she would die. But now all the blood seemed to freeze in her veins. Half fainting, she staggered back. Something went clatter, crack, crash, and the pane of the cupboard, which she had struck with her elbow, was shivered to pieces. At the same moment, she felt a smarting pain on her right arm, but at once a weight seemed to be taken off her heart, for she had heard no more squeaking and shrieking. All had become still, and, though she durst not look, she thought the mice, scared by the crash of glass, must have scurried back into their holes. But what happened next? Right behind Mary there arose a strange stir and a bustle in the cupboard, and tiny voices began to be heard. "Awake! Awake! Arms to take! This is the night! Rouse for the fight!" And then pealed out a pleasant, pretty chime of bells. "That is my little bell toy," cried Mary joyfully, springing quickly up to look. Now she saw how the cupboard was lighted up in some wonderful fashion, and how all its inhabitants were on foot. There were several figures there, besides the dolls, running about in confusion and striking with their little arms. All of a sudden, Nutcracker jumped up, threw the blankets far away, and sprang to his feet on the bed, shouting loudly his war cry of defiance. "Nick, knack, knack! Stupid mousy pack! Crick, crack, whack! Hew, hick, and hack!" And with this, he drew his little sword and waved it in the air and cried, "You, my dear vassals, friends, and brothers, will you stand by me in the hard battle?" At once spirited reply, 3 clowns and a pantaloon, 4 chimney sweepers, 2 fiddlers, and a drummer. "Yes, Lord, we hold to you with steadfast loyalty. With you we march to combat, to victory or death." And they pressed after the martial Nutcracker, who ventured a dangerous spring from the upper shelf. They, for their part, could well manage the jump, for not only were they thickly clothed in cloth and silk, but there was nothing inside of them but cotton and bran. So down they plumped, and as softly as bags of wool. But the poor Nutcracker, he would surely have broken his arms and legs, for, remember, it was nearly 2 feet high from the shelf on which he stood to the one below, and his body was as brittle as if cut out of matchwood. Yes, Nutcracker would surely have broken his limbs, had not, at the moment he leaped down, Missy Clara sprung from the sofa, and her soft arms received the hero with his drawn sword. "Ah, dear, kind Clara, how have I mistaken you?" sobbed out Mary. "I am sure you must have given up your bed to friend Nutcracker, and with good will after all." And now Missy Clara said, pressing the young hero gently to her silken breast, "Oh, sir, will you, sick and wounded as you are, yet expose yourself to combat and peril? See how eager for the fray are your bold vassals, and how they troop themselves as certain as of victory. Clowns, pantaloon, chimney sweepers, fiddlers, and drummer are already down below on the field, and the motto figurines in my compartment are all astir, preparing for the fight. Will you not, dear sir, rest in my arms, or behold the battle from the top of my high feather hat?" Thus spoke Clara. But Nutcracker behaved quite roughly, kicking so hard with his legs that the doll had soon let him go and set him on the ground. Immediately then he knelt gallantly on one knee, murmuring out, "Fair lady, ever in the thick of the combat will I remember the grace and favor thou hast shown me." At this, Clara bent down so low that she could seize him by both arms, lifted him softly up, made haste to loosen her richly spangled girdle, and would have thrown it over his shoulder if he had not taken 2 steps backwards, laying his hand upon his breast and speaking with formal politeness. "Do not deign, O lady, to waste your favors on me." Here he stopped short, sighed deeply, tore from his shoulder the ribbon with which Mary had bandaged him, pressed it to his lips, hung it round him as his cognizance, then, bravely brandishing his glittering unsheathed sword, sprang, light and active as a bird, over the ledge of the cupboard on to the doom. You remark, kind and honored reader, that Nutcracker, even before he really became alive, must have deeply felt the affectionate goodness with which Mary had treated him, and on this account only, because Mary was so kind, he would not take or wear a token from Missy Clara, splendid and beautiful as it was. The true-hearted Nutcracker chose rather to adorn himself with Mary's simple ribbon. But what now is going to happen? As soon as Nutcracker sprang down, the squeaking and the pattering broke out again. Under the big table swarm the deadly squadrons of countless mice, and over all towers the frightful 7-headed mouse king. How will the battle go? Chapter 5. The Battle. "Beat the general march, my trusty drummer," cried Nutcracker at the top of his voice, and at once the drummer began to rub-a-dub in the skillfulest way, so that the panes of the cupboard shook and echoed. Now came a crashing and clattering within, and Mary perceived that the lids of the various boxes in which Fred's army had been quartered were violently raised up, and out sprang the infantry and down onto the lower shelf, where they fell into the shining ranks. Nutcracker flew up and down, haranguing the troops in animating words. "Let no dog of a trumpeter blow or stir," he exclaimed angrily, and straightway turned to the pantaloon, who had grown somewhat pale, with a telltale chattering of his long chin, and addressed him in solemn tones. "General, I know your courage and your experience. Here quickens of eye and decision are all important. To you I entrust the command-in-chief of the cavalry and the artillery. You don't need a horse, as you have such long legs, and can gallop along on them well enough. Now, attend to your duty." Forthwith Pantaloon pressed his long, dry fingers upon his mouth, and gave such a piercing crow that it rang like the notes of 100 shrill bugles. Thereupon arose in the cupboard a neighing and a trampling, and lo, Fred's cuirassiers and dragons. But before all, the new gaily equipped hussars moved out, soon coming to a halt on the floor below. Now, with flying flags and clanging music, regiment after regiment defiled before Nutcracker, and drew themselves up in 3 lines, obliquely across the room. But in front Fred's cannon advanced rattling, with their gunners out each, and presently they began to go boom, boom, and Mary saw how their sugar-plum shot plunged into the masses of the mouse army, who became powdered all over and put greatly to shame. But particularly they suffered severe loss from a battery of heavy guns, which had taken up its position on Mamma's footstool, and boom, 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 kept volleying out gingerbread nuts among the mice, which did much execution. The mice, however, steadily advanced, and even came the length of taking a few of the guns, but still resounded the martial din, brr, boom, purr, boom, brr, till for smoke and dust Mary could scarcely see what was going on. Yet this much was certain, that each army fought with the utmost determination, that victory wavered from one side to the other. The mice kept on drawing out fresh sources, while their fire, very well delivered, took effect even as far as the glass cupboard. Clara and Gertrude ran up and down in despair, and wrung their hands till they were sore. "Am I to die in my blooming youth, I, the fairest of dolls?" screamed Clara. "Have I for this so carefully preserved my looks, to perish here within the walls of my home?" cried Gertrude. Then they fell upon one another's neck, and lamented so loudly as to be heard over all the wild tumult of the battle. For, worthy reader, you can scarcely have any idea of the scene that now raged. Prrr, prrr, puff, puff, piff, scallerdang, scallerdang, boom, brr-oom, boom, brr, boom, boom, brr-rum. A confusion of pealing, thundering, and roaring, amid which squeaked and squealed the mice and their sovereign. Then again rose Nutcracker's commanding voice, as he issued the necessary orders, and could be seen hurrying up to his battalions in the thick of fire. General Pantaloon had made some most dashing cavalry charges, and covered himself with glory. But Fred's hussars were driven back by the mouse artillery, which left deadly marks on their red jackets, and this checked their ardor. Pantaloon drew them off by the left, and in his excitement, he himself, with his cuirassiers and dragoons, executed the same movement. That is to say, that they all retired by the left and went home. Thus, the battery posted on the footstool became endangered, and before long the heavy column of fierce, ugly mice charged it so resolutely that footstool, guns, and gunners were all lost. The Nutcracker seemed confounded by dismay, and ordered the right wing to make a retrograde movement. You understand, my reader Fred, experienced in war as you are, that to make such a movement means much the same thing as running away. And, along with me, you already lament the disaster about to come on the army of Mary's beloved Nutcracker. Yet turn away your eyes from this sad spectacle, and regard the left wing of the Nutcrackerish army, where all still goes well, giving the soldiers and their commander good cause for hope. During the hottest of the fight, masses of mouse cavalry had been quietly debauching from under the chest of drawers, and with loud horrid squeaks had furiously hurled themselves upon Nutcracker's left wing. But what a resistance they met! Slowly, owing to the nature of the ground, it being difficult to pass the cupboard ledge, had the regiment of motto figures advanced under the leadership of 2 Chinese emperors, and formed themselves into a hollow square. These spirited, gaily equipped, and noble troops, consisting of many gardeners, Highlanders, Japanese, barbers, harlequins, cupids, lions, tigers, baboons, and apes, fought coolly, courageously, and steadily. By their Spartan bravery would this choice regiment have wrestled the victory from the foe, and not a daring captain of the hostile cavalry, rushing recklessly forward, bitten off the head of one of the Chinese emperors. Then the latter, in his fall, knocked over 2 Japanese and a baboon. This made a gap through which the enemy broke into the square, and soon the whole regiment was bitten to pieces. Yet the conquerors gained little advantage by this butchery, and soon as any of their bloodthirsty troopers had bitten a bold advisory in two, he found a small slip of printed paper in his throat, from which he died immediately. This did not much avail Nutcracker's army, which, retreat once begun, became more and more completely routed, and most men faster and faster, till the unfortunate Nutcracker, with a very small band of his comrades, was brought to bay close in front of the glass cupboard. "Bring up the reserves! Pantaloon, clown, drummer, where are you?" So shouted Nutcracker, who yet hopped to see fresh troops pouring out of the cupboard. There did not come out, indeed, a few brown men and women, made of gingerbread, with gilded faces, hats, and helmets, but they laid so clumsily about them that they struck none of the enemy, but instead knocked off the cap of their commander, Nutcracker himself. The light troops opposed them. The light troops opposed to them soon bit through their legs, so that they tumbled down, higgledy-piggledy, bringing some of their own comrades with them. Closely surrounded by foes, Nutcracker was now in the utmost danger and distress. He would have sprung back into the cupboard, but his legs were too short. Clara and Gertrude lay in a swoon. They could not help him. Hussars and dragoons galloped over him as he cried in despair, "A horse! A horse! My kingdom for a horse!" At that moment, two of the enemy's skirmishers seized him by his wooden cloak, and up rushed the Mouse King, squeaking out triumph from all his 7 throats. "Oh, my poor Nutcracker," sobbed out Mary, unable longer to restrain herself, hardly knowing what she did. She snatched off her left shoe and violently flung it at the Mouse King, right into the middle of his troops. That moment, all appeared to grow dim and to vanish away. But Mary felt in her right arm a still sharper pain than before, and fell fainting on the floor. Chapter 6. Laid Up. When Mary awoke out of her deep, death-like sleep, she was lying in her own bed, and the sun appeared shining clear and bright into the room through the windows covered with frost. By her side sat a strange gentleman, whom, however, she presently recognized as a surgeon. "She is awake now," said he softly, and up came her mother, regarding her with anxious looks of inquiry. "Oh, dear mother," murmured little Mary, "are all the mice gone, then, and is the good Nutcracker safe?" "Don't talk such silly stuff, Mary," answered her mother. "What have the mice to do with Nutcracker? But you, naughty child, you have given us all a great deal of trouble and anxiety. That comes of children having their own way and not obeying their parents. Last night you were playing with your toys very late. You grew sleepy, and it may be you were frightened by a mouse jumping out. Though there used to be no mice here, anyhow, you struck your arm against the glass of the cupboard and cut yourself so badly that this gentleman, who has just taken out the bits of glass sticking in your arm, says you might have got a serious injury, or even bleed to death. If the glass had cut a vein, thank God that I woke in the middle of the night. Then, when I found you not in bed, got up and went into the parlour. There you lay senseless beside the cupboard, and were bleeding fast. I had almost fainted away myself for fright to see you lying among a number of Fred's lead soldiers and other toys, broken motto figures, and gingerbread men. But the Nutcracker lay on your cut arm, and your left shoe was not far off." "Dear mother," broke in Mary, "these were the remains of the great fight between toys and mice, and what alarmed me so much was only the mice trying to take Nutcracker prisoner, who commanded the toy army. Then I threw my shoe among the mice, and after that I didn't know what happened." The surgeon looked meaningly at the other, who said very gently to Mary, "Never mind, my dear child. Keep yourself easy. The mice are all gone, and Nutcracker is safe and sound in the cupboard. Here, Dr. Stahlbaum came into the room and had a long conversation with the surgeon. Then he felt Mary's pulse, and she could make out that they were talking about fever. She had to lie in bed and take medicine, and as this lasted for several days, although, except the pain in her arm, she did not feel the matter with her. She knew that the Nutcracker had come safe out of the battle, and he had often appeared to her as in a dream, speaking quite plainly, but in a very sad voice. "My dearest lady, I am deeply indebted to you, but there is yet more which you can do for me." Mary thought a great deal over this speech, but had no idea what it might be that she could do for him. She was not able to play much with toys, on account of her wounded arm, and if she tried to read or turn over picture books, there came such a strange swimming in her eyes that she had to leave off. So time passed wearisomely slow for her, and she had scarcely patience to wait for the twilight hour which came so welcome, for then her mother sat on the bed a while and read or told her such pretty stories. One evening, her mother had just finished the most entertaining story of Prince Charming when the door opened, and in came Godfather Drosselmeyer with these words, Now I must really see for myself how my sick and wounded Mary is getting on." As soon as Mary saw Godfather Drosselmeyer in his drab coat, there returned to her a clear memory of that night when Nutcracker lost the battle against the mice, and she could not keep herself from crying out loud to the counselor, "Oh, Godfather Drosselmeyer, you were so ugly. I saw you very well sitting over the clock and covering it with your wings to prevent it from striking loudly, not to scare away the mice. I heard you very well calling to the Mouse King. Why did you not come up to help Nutcracker and me, you ugly Godfather Drosselmeyer? Isn't it all your fault, then, that I have to lie sick and wounded in bed?" "Whatever is the matter with you, dear Mary?" asked her mother, quite startled. But Godfather Drosselmeyer made some very queer faces, and snarled out a sort of sing-song thus, "Pendulum tick-tock, clock, clock, click, click. Hammer goes ding, dong, ding. Hour rings out ting, ting. Hunt away, Mouse King. Owl spreads her light wing. Toys now may dance and sing. Clock strikes out ting, ding. All the works click, click. Pendulum goes tick, tick. Click, tick, whir, pirr. Bim, boom, bang, brr. Ding, dong, so ends my song." Mary stared at Godfather Drosselmeyer with eyes opened to their widest, for he looked quite different, and even much uglier than his usual self, and moved his right arm up and down like a puppet pulled by strings. He would have really terrified her if her mother had not been there, and if presently Fred, having slipped in meanwhile, had not burst out into a wild laugh. "Oh, Godfather Drosselmeyer, you are so funny today," he cried. "You are going on exactly like my old jumping jack, which I threw away behind the stove a long time ago." But their mother said, looking serious, "Dear Mr. Counselor, this is a strange kind of fun. What may be the meaning of it?" "Dear me," answered Drosselmeyer, laughing, "don't you remember my pretty clockmaker's song? I am in the way of singing it always to patients like Mary." Then he sat down close to Mary's bed and said, "You must not be offended if I have not cut out all the Mouse King's 14 eyes. But that is out of the question, and instead of it I am going to give you a great pleasure." With this, the counselor put his hand into his pocket, and what he now slowly drew forth was no other than the Nutcracker, whose lost teeth had very clearly been set firm again, and mended his broken jaw. Many cried out for joy, and her mother said with a smile, You see now how well Godfather Drosselmeyer meant by your Nutcracker? That you must own, Mary, interrupted the counselor, and you must own also that Nutcracker has not grown quite so straight as he might have done, and that his looks can't be called handsome. If you care to hear it, I will tell you how his ugliness came into this family. Or perhaps you already know the history of Princess Pirplat, of the witch Mousikins, and of the skillful clockmaker. Just listen, suddenly broke in Fred. Just listen, Godfather Drosselmeyer. You have put in Nutcracker's teeth right enough, and his chin is no more so wobbly. But why is his sword gone? Why have you not given him a sword? Yeah, replied the counselor, not very well pleased. You fuss and find fault about everything, youngster. What business of mine is Nutcracker's sword? I have healed his body, and he can get a sword for himself as he pleases. Well, that's true, cried Fred. If he is a brave fellow, he will soon manage to find weapons. Well, Mary, went on the counselor, tell me if you know the story of Princess Pirplat. Ah, no, answered Mary. Do tell us it, dear Grandfather Drosselmeyer. Do tell us. I hope, said the doctor's wife, I hope, dear Mr. Counselor, that your story is not such a creepy one as those you tell usually are. Not at all, dearest lady, answered Drosselmeyer. On the contrary, what I am going to have the honor to lay before you is very amusing. Oh, do tell us. Oh, do, dear grandfather, cried the children, and the counselor thus began his tale. And we will stop here today, and we will pick up with chapter 7 and the story of the hard nut. Thank you for tuning in today to Storytime Classics Live, produced by Southwest Shakespeare Company. I am your host, Bo Heckman. If you're going outside today, please be careful and please wear a mask.